A young doctor vanished from her New York City home on the eve of a national tragedy, leaving behind a personal tragedy while the nation mourned. On the night of September 10th, 2001, Dr. Sneha Philip was captured on a department store security camera near her lower Manhattan apartment. This was the last confirmed glimpse of her alive. The next day, chaos engulfed the city, and Sneha never returned home. Nearly 25 years later, we're no closer to solving the mystery of this missing 31-year-old physician with a bright future ahead. Sneha was a 31-year-old Indian-American physician living in New York City with her husband, Dr. Ron Lieberman. Born in Kerala, India, and raised in New York, Sneha was known for her intelligence, creativity, and vibrant personality. She graduated from Johns Hopkins University and attended medical school in Chicago, where she met Ron. They married in 2000 and settled into an apartment just a few blocks from the World Trade Towers. Professionally, Dr. Philip was in the midst of her medical training, working as a resident at St. Vincent's Hospital in 2001. However, her life was not without troubles. Earlier that year, she had been let go from a prior residency at Cabrini Medical Center amid allegations of attendance problems and alcohol-related issues. One evening out with colleagues ended with Sneha spending a night in jail after accusing a fellow intern of groping her. This claim backfired into a charge of filing a false report, though it was never proven whether her claim was false given her disappearance. Contrary to what many sources imply, her case was still making its way through the courts, and it's entirely possible that she hadn't made a false report at all. By September 2001, she had pleaded not guilty to that misdemeanor charge and had been temporarily suspended from her new residency for missing a required counseling session. Loved ones say Sneha was depressed during this time and sometimes coped by drinking and staying out late. Her family has always maintained that she and Ron were working through these challenges and hoped for better days ahead. On her day off on September 10th, 2001, Sneha spent the afternoon catching up with her mother. She mentioned plans to visit the windows on the World Restaurant atop the North Tower of the World Trade Center soon, where a friend's wedding was scheduled for next spring. Ending her call with her mom around 4 p.m., Sneha ran errands in the neighborhood. She dropped off laundry at a dry cleaner, then went shopping at the Century 21 department store near the Twin Towers. Using her American Express card, she bought several items of clothing and bedding. A surveillance camera time-stamped around 7 p.m. recorded her browsing the store's racks, the last confirmed sighting of Sneha. What happened after Sneha left the store remains a mystery. She didn't return to her apartment that night, and her husband Ron came home around midnight to an empty apartment. He wasn't alarmed, she often stayed out late, and went to bed. At about 4 a.m. on the following morning, a call from their home phone to Ron's cell went unanswered. Ron slept through it. By 6:30 a.m., when Ron left for work, Sneha still hadn't come home. That morning, catastrophe struck the World Trade Center. Ron hurried back to their apartment that evening, using his hospital ID to get through roadblocks. Inside, he found a surreal scene. A layer of gray dust from the collapsed towers coated every surface. The couple's 2 kittens had left tiny paw prints in the dust, but there were no human footprints, a sign that Sneha had never returned home. In the days that followed, Sneha was listed among the thousands of people missing in New York City. They plastered missing person flyers with her face around Manhattan and contacted hospitals and shelters, but found no trace of her. Sneha officially became the only person on the missing list with no confirmed connection to the attacks of that day. Frustrated by the lack of official progress, Ron Lieberman began investigating on his own. He confirmed Sneha's shopping trip via credit card records and obtained the store's security footage, which showed her leaving alone without incident. With police resources overwhelmed at the time, Ron hired a private investigator named Ken Gallant. Gallant uncovered two key clues, suggesting Sneha may have returned to her apartment building on the morning of that fateful day. First, the mysterious 4 a.m. phone call from their home phone to Ron's cell hinted that Sneha might have come home briefly before dawn. Second, a lobby security camera captured a blurry silhouette of a woman entering the building at 8:43 a.m., just minutes before the first plane struck. Notably, this person wasn't carrying any of the shopping bags Sneha had from the previous evening. That said, despite that, the woman has never been conclusively identified and may have been the missing physician. Ron and his private investigator also considered whether Sneha might have deliberately vanished during the chaos, but they found no evidence of such plans. She left behind her passport, driver's license, credit cards, except the one used that night, and even her glasses. No bank withdrawals or other signs indicated any plan to start a new life. With no other leads, the investigator and her husband eventually concluded that she most likely lost her life in the attacks that day. When the NYPD opened a formal missing person case, detectives uncovered aspects of her life that pointed to alternate scenarios. They learned of her job troubles and pending criminal charge, as well as reports of her late-night socializing. According to the police, in the weeks before she vanished, Sneha often stayed out until early morning at downtown bars, sometimes going home with people she met. She spent significant time out at gay and lesbian establishments, and it's been speculated that she may have had relationships with women in the period leading up to her disappearance. Investigators even suggested her marriage was strained and cited an alleged argument between Sneha and Ron on the morning of September 10th, a claim Ron strongly denies. Sneha's family disputes much of this portrayal, calling it somewhere between exaggerated or false. They acknowledge she had a difficult period but insist she was not reckless or planning to abandon her life. Nevertheless, the NYPD theorized that Sneha's personal struggles meant her disappearance could have been unrelated to the broader world events of that day. For years after Sneha's disappearance, authorities were unsure whether to count her as a victim of the attacks that day. In 2006, a Manhattan court ruled that there wasn't sufficient evidence to link Sneha's presumed death to the attacks. For legal purposes, her date of death was set as September 10, 2004, 3 years after she went missing. Her family challenged this decision, arguing that circumstantial evidence strongly suggested she perished at the World Trade Center. They also noted other cases where victims were included despite similarly minimal evidence. On January 31, 2008, the appeals court reversed the earlier ruling, and the court concluded Sneha died in the attacks and ordered her name added to the official list. This, however, is cold comfort to those who want to know the truth of Sneha's disappearance. The potential plausibility of so many theories has ensured that Sneha's case will continue to receive attention for years to come, and will hopefully be solved one day in the future. Also, I don't generally ask this directly, but given how well known her case is, I'm interested in hearing everyone's theories about what happened to Sneha in the comments. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, with that regular reminder to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Also, don't forget that you can also get some of my content in podcast form by searching Lazy Chill True Crime wherever you listen to your podcasts. And of course, I have to mention the YouTube membership and Patreon if you want to take your support to the next level. Many of the topics I cover put my videos at risk for demonetization, and your support helps me insulate against this censorship. Imagine strolling along a peaceful canal on a Sunday afternoon, only to stumble upon a scene from a nightmare. In late spring 2009, a passerby near the Belgian-Dutch border made a gruesome discovery. the body of a young woman floating in the Albert Canal near the village of Lenay. 16 years later, this Jane Doe remains nameless, known only by the haunting moniker of the Lenay Girl. The location was significant, less than a mile from the Dutch border near Maastricht in the Netherlands. The proximity to another country would soon complicate the investigation. But first responders focused on the immediate facts. The victim was a female, estimated to be in her mid-teens to early 20s. The state of the body made it instantly clear this was no accident. She had been brutally attacked and slain. While I don't usually get too deep into the details of what happened to the victim, it's necessary to do so here, as you'll see when I'm discussing theories of the case. Her legs were bound with rope and her throat had been cut, and she had sustained multiple stab wounds. In a grim effort to conceal the crime, the killer had weighed down the body with a pair of heavy dumbbells, likely hoping she would sink out of sight in the canal's depths. Despite these efforts, the canal eventually gave up its secret. Authorities believe her remains had been in the water for anywhere from 1 to 5 weeks before surfacing, meaning she could have been slain well before that late May day. Local Belgian police from the Francophone region of Wallonia took charge of the case. Because the body was found in French-speaking territory, initial media coverage was largely in French, and the case got little attention in the neighboring Netherlands. Additionally, there was little news coverage in the Flemish-speaking part of Belgium or in Germany or Luxembourg. This gap in publicity may have hindered early efforts to identify the victim or find witnesses, especially if the young woman was from the Dutch side or another country entirely. Nonetheless, investigators began piecing together what scant evidence the crime scene provided. The autopsy and forensic examination yielded several critical clues. She stood about 5 feet 4 inches tall and had an athletic build, weighing roughly 115 pounds. Her hair was medium-length blonde or light brown, and her complexion was fair. Her teeth were in good condition, suggesting she had access to dental care and maintained a well-put-together appearance, including a set of expensive nails. Both ears were pierced, indicating she likely wore earrings in life. Perhaps most intriguingly, the medical examiner noted 2 surgical scars on the body, one about 10 centimeters long on her right wrist, and another on her lower abdomen. Such details could potentially match medical records or be recognized by someone who knew a girl who had these surgeries, but no matches have surfaced yet. Right away, forensic investigators also searched for any signs of indecent assault or substances. Those results have not been made public, but the absence of clothing itself was telling. One of the biggest breakthroughs in the investigation came from forensic isotope analysis and other advanced techniques that were applied to the victim's remains. These analyses examined traces of certain chemicals in teeth, bones, or hair that can reveal geological clues about where a person lived. The results were striking, though not totally unexpected. Investigators determined that the Lenay girl had spent her childhood in Eastern Europe. She had then lived in the Benelux region for several years leading up to her death. In other words, this young woman likely originated from Eastern Europe, perhaps one of the countries of the former Soviet bloc or nearby. Sometime in her teenage years, she moved west to the area of Belgium, the Netherlands, or a neighboring country such as Germany. This could have been with family, as a migrant or student, or perhaps in the company of people who didn't have her best interests at heart. Unfortunately, despite this insight, her identity remains unknown in both regions. No missing person report in Belgium or the Netherlands fit her description, and reaching into Eastern Europe for matches has so far yielded nothing conclusive. Early in the case, police pursued leads on the ground. Indeed, a witness came forward reporting something potentially crucial. Two unknown men were spotted near a lock on the canal shortly before the body was discovered. They were seen with a vehicle described as a tow truck, only a few hundred meters from the recovery site. Based on witness descriptions, police created composite sketches of these individuals. Both men were approximately 20 to 30 years old with dark, wavy hair. Authorities have not identified these men, but they believe they may have been involved in the crime, or at least know what happened. Despite circulating the sketches, the two men have never come forward and remain unidentified. With so many unanswered questions, a number of theories have emerged about who the Lenné girl was and what chain of events led to her brutal demise. While none of these theories can be proven without further evidence, each offers a possible glimpse into the dark circumstances that might fit the known facts. One prevalent theory is that the Lenné girl was caught up in a human trafficking network or some form of exploitation. Young women from Eastern Europe have unfortunately been targets for trafficking rings that bring victims to Western Europe for illicit labor. If the Jane Doe had been trafficked, it could explain why she lived in the area for years. Yet no official records or family inquiries have surfaced. She may have been kept off the grid intentionally. Traffickers also have been known to use extreme violence to prevent escape or silence their victims. The manner of her slaying suggests rage was a factor, which some have suggested seems unlikely if she were a trafficking victim. That said, personally, I have trouble believing that someone who's willing to participate in human trafficking would have difficulty with a brutal manner of slaying. Further, by making the attack look so extremely personal, the traffickers may have simply been trying to throw the authorities off. Another possibility is that the young woman came to Belgium of her own accord and then fell victim to foul play by an acquaintance or partner. She could have been a migrant worker or a domestic worker, which might not always be formally registered, hence leaving little in the way of a paper trail. If she had a boyfriend, friend, or someone from her community who turned violent, it might explain the personal nature of the attack. Stabbing often indicates anger or personal motive, which is why some prefer this theory over the trafficking angle. Some have also speculated about the involvement of a serial offender or random attacker, though this theory is less supported by evidence. The brutality of the attack and the effort to hide the body could indicate a practiced perpetrator. However, no other similar unsolved cases in the area from that period have been definitively linked. Being from a foreign country, she might have been more vulnerable if she didn't have a strong local support network. The Lenné area, being at a crossroads of countries, could attract truckers or travelers. Perhaps a transient perpetrator took advantage of the cross-border complexity. Each theory must grapple with the same core puzzle. Why has no one identified this young woman after so many years? Police have her DNA profile and even compared it across countries, but no matches to any family or missing persons have emerged. This strongly suggests she either wasn't reported missing, or if she was, it was perhaps in a place not yet connected to international databases. The Lenné girl's case saw a resurgence of attention in 2023 when Interpol launched the Operation Identify Me campaign. This is a coordinated international effort to finally give names to 22 unidentified victims found across Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany. So far, the renewed spotlight has not led to an identification, but investigators remain cautiously optimistic. When I consider the facts of the Lenné girl case, the scenario that feels most plausible to me is that she was a victim of trafficking. Her Eastern European origins, identified through isotope analysis, strongly support this theory. Unfortunately, young women from Eastern Europe are disproportionately targeted by human traffickers. Her well-maintained appearance, such as manicured nails, might indicate that she was compelled to keep herself attractive. This is a common tactic used by traffickers to maximize their victims' appeal, which in turn means they can crank more illicit profit out of them. Further, traffickers tend to keep their victims well maintained so that they don't raise any red flags by their appearance alone. Additionally, the severity and brutality of the crime suggests it was committed by someone who viewed her life as disposable. The deliberate concealment of her body, bound, weighted down, and discarded in a canal, points to calculated violence, typical of traffickers wanting to erase all evidence. Moreover, the absence of any missing persons report or identifiable documentation matches patterns commonly seen with trafficking victims. Families often don't know their loved ones' whereabouts, or fear prevents them from reporting disappearances. Perhaps her family back in Eastern Europe would like to come forward with information, but police can't even protect witnesses located in their own jurisdiction. The Belgian cops would have no ability to protect an Eastern European family from retaliation by local organized crime syndicates if they came forward. Lastly, her location, so close to the Belgian-Dutch border, feels deliberate. Borders represent convenient areas for traffickers to operate under the radar, exploiting jurisdictional confusion. To me, all of these factors taken together form a tragically coherent picture of exploitation and violence. I firmly believe the Lane girl was trapped in the nightmare of human trafficking, a reality that many like her tragically face, invisible to the world until it's far too late. Now, for those of you who are regular viewers and listeners, you know what I'm going to suggest next. If this was a case in America or Canada, genetic genealogy could crack this wide open. However, since the laws in Europe are very different at present, it appears that the Lane girl Jane Doe might simply remain unidentified. This leaves her without her name, and the people who did this to her able to walk free and victimize other young women. Imagine sailing on a calm day in the South Pacific when a distress call suddenly crackles over the radio. An SOS so chilling it sends shivers down the spine of even seasoned sailors. A Morse code transmission from a vessel calling itself the Orang Medan pleads for help. The radio operator taps out a dire report that the captain and officers are dead. Likely the entire crew has met the same fate. After a tense pause, the sender's final message comes through. He too is dying. It was a message straight out of a nightmare. An entire ship's crew apparently dead for no discernible reason, pleading for urgent help. Alarmed by that phantom SOS, nearby American merchant ships picked up the distress call, and the closest vessel, often identified as the Silver Star, races toward the given coordinates. At the reported location, they find the Orang Medan adrift and eerily silent. Some of the rescuers later described feeling an unnatural chill inside the ship, despite the tropical heat outside, adding to the sense that they had stepped into a floating nightmare. When the rescue party boards the vessel, they are met with a nightmare scene. The entire crew is dead. Bodies lie scattered with no obvious wounds or injuries. Yet the look on the faces of the fallen is horrifying. Eyes wide open and mouths frozen mid-scream, as if their last moments were spent in unimaginable fear. Even the ship's dog lies dead, teeth still bared as though snarling at some unseen threat. With no survivors in sight, the would-be rescuers search for answers in vain. In the radio room, they find the operator who sent the SOS, now lifeless at his station with his hand still on the Morse key. Not a single clue indicates what disaster befell the crew. It's as if death swept over everyone on board in an instant, without a sound or struggle. As the astonished team considers towing the ghost ship to port, they suddenly notice smoke seeping from below deck. A fire has broken out in the cargo hold, cutting their investigation short. The boarding party barely makes it back to the Silver Star before the Orang Medan erupts in a violent explosion. Within minutes, the fateful freighter sinks beneath the waves, carrying its dark secrets to the ocean floor. All that remains is the story, a chilling account destined to become a maritime legend. What could have killed an entire crew so swiftly without leaving a mark on their bodies? Over the decades, several explanations have been proposed, some more plausible than others. Easily, the most popular theory is that the crew was poisoned by toxic cargo. One specific version of this theory claims the ship's hold was filled with potassium cyanide and nitroglycerin. This is a combination that could produce toxic fumes and a deadly explosion if exposed to seawater. Many suspect the Orang Medan was secretly carrying dangerous chemicals, possibly leftover wartime nerve agents or other lethal substances, without proper safety measures. A leak or accidental mixture could have released poisonous gases that snuffed out the crew almost instantly. Such chemicals could also account for the sudden fire and explosion that followed, reacting violently when exposed to seawater. Another hypothesis is carbon monoxide poisoning from a malfunctioning boiler. Carbon monoxide gas is odorless and could have quietly suffocated the crew without warning, which might explain the lack of injuries. However, this theory doesn't entirely fit the evidence. It fails to explain the reports of terrified expressions on the victims' faces, or the explosive finale. A few have even floated the idea of piracy, suggesting that they boarded and used some kind of gas to disable all the occupants. But the ship was found intact and undisturbed, which doesn't line up with an attack for plunder. And of course, there are the paranormal speculations. Ghostly forces, vengeful spirits, even extraterrestrial involvement have all been suggested in fringe discussions. These fantastical theories have no evidence to support them. They mainly underscore just how baffling the Orang Medan mystery is. Finally, some have wondered if the entire incident was covered up. If the Orang Medan was involved in a clandestine operation, perhaps authorities deliberately wiped it from the records and hushed up any witnesses. What you may have noticed is that I didn't question the very foundation of the incident itself, which probably seems logical given how often this case is spoken about. It turns out the biggest question surrounding the Orang Medan mystery is whether any of it happened at all. In the absence of evidence, many suspect that this ghost ship never existed. For starters, no ship named Orang Medan appears in any official records. Researchers have scoured registries and shipping logs, but they've found nothing. A vessel of this size and era should have left some trace, yet there isn't a single legitimate reference to an Orang Medan outside the story itself. That glaring absence is a huge red flag, and it suggests that if a disaster did occur, the ship might have been operating under a different name or outside normal channels. Furthermore, while the rescue ship Silver Star itself was a real merchant vessel, investigators found no record in the Silver Star's logs of any such incident or rescue. If the crew of the Silver Star had truly come upon a ship full of dead men, it is unlikely they would simply sail on without reporting it. The timeline and location details are equally inconsistent, casting more doubt on the story's veracity. Most versions place the incident in the late 1940s around the crowded Strait of Malacca. However, in the earliest known report from late 1940, there was a virtually identical incident near the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific. The major difference between this earliest version is that the creepypasta-type elements were nowhere to be found. In a November 1940 news article, an unnamed merchant marine officer described receiving a strange distress signal. He then notes that he found a ship full of dead sailors before witnessing an explosion that sank the vessel. When basic facts like the date, location, and rescuers keep changing from one source to another, it becomes nearly impossible to verify the truth of the tale. What we do know is that after 1945, the Orang Medan story gained broader circulation through a handful of publications. In early 1948, a Dutch-language Indonesian newspaper ran a series of articles about the supposed incident. These reports, attributed to an Italian writer named Silvio Shirley, introduced the vivid details that have since become legend. Interestingly, the final article in the series included a disclaimer admitting that the paper had no further evidence that the story was real. However, the paper did state that Silvio swore the whole thing was true, and as everyone in the world knows, when the great Silvio Shirley gives his word, you can take that to the bank. From there, the legend kept growing, and surprisingly found its way into some very official sources. Newspapers in the US picked up the story later in 1948, and by 1952 it even appeared in an official Coast Guard bulletin called The Proceedings of the Merchant Marine Council. Further, a declassified CIA document references the event later in the 1950s, though doesn't comment on the veracity of what actually happened. A few books and magazines on unsolved mysteries reprinted the tale over the years and expanded upon it. And of course, here we are in the age of YouTube and TikTok and podcasts, where the story has been repeated uncritically countless times. With no hard evidence to go on, most now lean toward the simplest explanation. The Orang Medan is likely nothing more than a sea story. The tale has all the hallmarks of an urban legend, plenty of dramatic flourish that make you want to retell it, but zero documentation whatsoever. Despite exhaustive searches, no crew manifests, ownership records, or legitimate registrations for this ship have ever been found. Simply put, while the secondary sources are there, the primary evidence that should also exist doesn't exist, at least not officially. No family members ever came forward claiming their loved ones were lost on a ship called the Orang Medan. These gaps make it highly likely that no such vessel ever sailed under that name, and that the story was probably a fabrication. Still, some believe that it may be a gross exaggeration of a real but less sensational event that did indeed happen in 1940. However, as of yet, no one has been able to conclusively tie the case to any real incident, despite extensive investigations. Mary Seymour entered the world at Sudley Castle on August 30th, 1548, as the only child of Dowager Queen Catherine Parr and her husband, Sir Thomas Seymour. Just 6 days after Mary's arrival, Catherine Parr died from childbirth complications. Within 6 months, Mary's father Thomas was executed for treason in March 1549. For Catherine, who had been married 4 times, most notably to King Henry VIII, Mary was her only child. The sole offspring of Henry's last queen was now an orphan in one of the most turbulent courts of the Tudor age. Mary's royal connections made her an important infant. Her mother had been a Queen of England, and her father was the brother of the late Queen Jane Seymour, making Mary a close relative of the Tudor royal family. As the Dowager Queen's daughter, Mary wasn't technically a princess, but she was one of the highest-born children of her generation. She was even named in honor of Henry VIII's elder daughter, Princess Mary, the future Queen Mary, reflecting hopes for the child's lofty future. However, noble birth offered little protection to a baby in the volatile aftermath of King Henry VIII's death. Before his downfall, Thomas Seymour had entrusted Mary's care to Catherine Willoughby, Duchess of Suffolk, a close friend of Catherine Parr. In early 1549, the infant was moved to the Duchess's country seat at Grimsthorpe Castle in Lincolnshire. The Duchess accepted the duty but soon lamented that caring for the orphan was a heavy burden. As the daughter of the Dowager Queen, Mary, though not technically a princess, was expected to be raised in extreme luxury, which strained her guardian's resources. Notably, the Duchess believed that she would receive support from individuals who had prospered under the Queen Dowager. However, those who had become increasingly wealthy from Catherine's favor failed to offer any assistance for her baby daughter's upkeep. The Crown had allotted £500 per year for Mary's maintenance, an enormous sum at the time, but even this wasn't enough to maintain the child in what was viewed as an appropriate manner. The government eventually provided some additional help. In January 1550, Parliament passed an act restoring to young Mary the right to inherit what little remained of her father's estates. Much of Thomas Seymour's wealth was already picked over, but the act at least made the child eligible for further support. On March 13, 1550, the Privy Council granted these funds to help cover Mary's household expenses. Notably, this record from spring 1550 is the last known trace of Lady Mary Seymour in contemporary documents. After that date, Mary disappears from the historical record. No further mention of her life or death has been found. No one ever claimed the comparatively small inheritance on her behalf, which strongly suggests that Mary didn't live long enough to use it. Most historians conclude that she died in early childhood, likely before her second birthday. Such an early death wouldn't have been unusual. Infant mortality was high in Tudor times, but the absence of any recorded burial or comment about her passing is perplexing. Parish registers by then were supposed to note deaths, especially of well-born persons. Yet Mary's demise went unrecorded. One would expect the Duchess of Suffolk to announce Mary's death as well, but no such report was made. Perhaps any record of Mary's burial was lost over time, or her guardians kept her death under wraps amid the political upheaval of the era. However, there is, of course, a much darker theory about what happened to Mary Seymour. All records indicate that Catherine Willoughby, the Duchess of Suffolk, was extremely unhappy to have been put in charge of the child, and viewed her as a burden. She had initially expected the child may bring her some benefit, in the form of assistance from Catherine Parr's associates, but this never materialized. Under this theory, Mary Seymour essentially became a white elephant, so to speak. That is to say, she was someone who was impossibly expensive for the Duchess to maintain. This has led some to speculate that the Duchess eliminated Mary Seymour and tried to keep the entire thing secret. This explains why there are no records of her death. Further, given the turmoil of the time, the whereabouts of Mary simply weren't top of mind. After all, despite her high-born status, her father had fallen from grace, and the Queen Dowager was deceased. All that said, there's no evidence that the Duchess actually committed such an act, and this theory remains entirely circumstantial. Mary's fate soon passed into legend as one of Tudor England's unsolved mysteries. A popular Victorian writer refused to believe Mary had truly died, claiming instead that the girl survived and was eventually at the court of King James I. This notion, however, isn't supported by evidence and is considered highly implausible. Another tale suggested Mary was spirited away to be raised by a family in Ireland, but this too lacks historical proof. A more convincing clue about Mary's end emerged in a Latin poem published in 1573 by John Parkhurst, who had been Queen Catherine's chaplain. This connection, made by Linda Porter, a British historian, is now considered to have likely solved this mystery. The poem is an epitaph mourning a child whom her queenly mother bore at the cost of her own life, and who now rests under a marble stone after a brief life. The verse doesn't name the child, but this is strongly believed to be a reference to Mary Seymour. Notably, if this was the case, there's the potential that her remains may be found on the grounds of Grimsthorpe Castle. That said, there have been numerous changes to the site over the course of the intervening centuries, and it appears that this mystery may never be conclusively solved.